Hi, Misha here, and quite recently I released a 3-hour video looking at MiG jets. Nearly all variants, with one or two missing, like the 27, because there just isn't one available in 172 scale diecast or even 172 scale. That's the scale I collect. Since I had to get my MiGs down, and since everything needed dusting anyway, most of the Sukhois came down. And so, why not do a video too? And most of the Sukhois are based on the Su-27. Some of them directly, and some of them more just inspired. And these range really just, most of them are all 4th generation with 1/5, also what they call 4 plus. So we really have more generations of the Sukhoi itself. Kind of a generation 1, 1.5, and 2. And it's really interesting how these have supplanted MiGs in the modern Russian Air Forces, Space Forces, the VKS, and to a lesser extent in the Russian Navy, although they still do operate the MiG-29K. And of course we have other MiGs like the MiG-31 and the VKS as well. But yeah, we'll get into it. A lot of the specs here are going to be the same. And at the end, we'll kind of talk about what we like and don't like and what have you. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, I do have a Patreon. It's mainly for the main Mishaco channel. But yeah, these videos do take a lot of effort. So any support, even if it's just sharing it with people, is great. Just here to hang out, talk about history, talk about the mechanics of it as much as I can know, and I will get things wrong. It's a bit challenging for me not being able to see pictures of things like missiles. I do my best to kind of parse out what things are, but I will get things wrong. On the other hand, sometimes Hobby Master gets things wrong too. The ones on the table right now are all Hobby Master. The majority of what you see in this video will be Hobby Master, but there will be some others. These aren't all the aircraft that we'll go over today. But to see what appears, just keep on watching. And I don't blame you one bit for taking a few days to watch this video, because it took me damn near a week to make it. With that, let's go back in time and talk about the earliest flankers. So in the last video we left off with the MiG-29, the Fulcrum, and I have the early version out here, well, the 29S, because we're going to do some comparing. This was the lightweight tactical fighter, and the program started all the way back in 1971-72. So this video, of course, is on its little and bigger brother from Sukhoi. We know today is the Su-27 flanker, and it started off as the T-10. Sukhoi had been making aircraft for decades, of course, but up until this point they were more known for attack aircraft, strike aircraft, close air support aircraft, swing wing aircraft. This was a bit of a departure for them, and it showed in a protracted development. This was to have more range, better endurance, able to carry more weapons. The heavy fighter was to patrol the air, intercept Allied B-1Bs and other bombers. It was also to serve as a escort for Russian bombers if they're going into enemy territory, have enough range to keep up with them, or even serve as a deep penetration strike aircraft. So it was designed, much like with the MiG-29, to have a limited air-to-surface ability, although it was very nascent in the beginning. It was designed as an air superiority fighter like the MiG. But whereas the MiG was more akin to like the F-16, F-18, something small and light, agile, this was akin to the F-15 or F-14, large, powerful, speed, carriage ability, altitude. Although, thanks to its design, relatively slim profile, its cross-section, it was surprisingly agile for its size. Either way, the very first prototype, the T-10, flew in 1977, and it had problems. In fact, the second prototype actually crashed and was destroyed in 1978. This would lead to a revised model, the T-10S, which is closer to this you see here. It would first fly in 1981, and it would be developed through 1982 and officially accepted for service at the time, but it still wasn't ready yet. The pre-production aircraft used the Saturn AL-31 engine, 2 of them, but the full production would actually have the uprated AL-31F engines, and the first ones would not be delivered until 1985, at least, outside of testing. But even then, you've got very low rate production. Even after they had worked out the design, then they had to work out manufacturing. This was, again, Sukhoi wasn't really set up for this, and Russia really wasn't set up for this. And of course, by the time it started to be delivered, the USSR was coming apart at the seams. In fact, it didn't really fully achieve operational service until 1990. So just before the disillusionment of the Warsaw Pact in general. But even though there was a bit of a mess, and the MiG was clearly ahead at this time, Sukhoi ended up delivering a very good fighter, and, well, that's why it kind of became the basis, the norm, the standard in the Russian Federation throughout the 90s and 2000s. This Hobbymaster model is an early variant from circa 1987 during some mock intercepts with Allied aircraft. That would be the first time the Allies would see it in the air, and then the Russians would show it off at the Paris Air Show in 1989. Remember, they had shown off the MiG-29 in Finland in 86 and in England in 1988, so now they're starting to show off the Flanker, as NATO named it, at this point. And the Flanker B is the production model. There are 2 types. The Su-27S for the VVS to operate as a heavy tactical fighter, and the Su-27P for the PVO to operate as a fighter, interceptor, bomber, escort, more. And the only real difference, since both of course have radar, is that the PVO doesn't have any ground attack abilities at all, and of course different communication systems, just to be compliant with the PVO. The truth is, not very many of those would go in because of changes. In some ways, this is very similar to the MiG, just scaled up pretty drastically. Our MiG over here is 57 feet long with a 37-foot wingspan. Not tiny, but pretty small. This is nearly 72 feet long and has a wingspan of over 48 feet. It's bigger. We have 2, both are twin-engine planes, but these are much larger. And you'll notice there are no tanks. The MiG-29 initially had 1 external tank. Later would have up to 3. Even then, it had limited range. The Su-27, well, its tankage was all internal in the big wing in the body. And it carried a good amount of fuel. And it was most efficient at high altitudes. It had a maximum height of about 62,000 feet, compared with the MiG-29's 59,000. It was a little bit faster at high altitude compared with the MiG max of about Mach 2.35 versus the MiG's 2.25. Now, at sea level, low altitude, the MiG was ever so slightly faster, about Mach 1.2 versus 1.1 here. Yeah, this thing is designed for high performance cruising. And at high cruising, high efficiency, it had very respectable range. Of course, loadout would change it somewhat, but you're looking at around 1,500 miles. Single seater, at least this version. This was Russia's first fly-by-wire aircraft. It had one internal 30mm cannon with 150 rounds, so the same as the original MiG. The later MiG-29s would downgrade that to 100. And whereas the MiG carried 6 missiles, 2 R-27s, and either 4 R-60s or 4 of the new R-73s, the Su-27 had a total of 10 hard points, and since no fuel tanks, it could carry more. Now, the wingtips could only really carry R-73s. Some data sheets list R-60s, but I don't know, aside from maybe just testing, that R-60s were ever put on this. It's a R-73. And it could carry up to 6 of them, the other 2 under each wing if it needed to. Or it could have 4 R-73s and 6 R-27s. 2 under the wing, 2 under the engine casements, and then 2 in the center line in that little slipway, very F-14 style. Although, of course, rarely would you get the full 6 27s and 4 73 loadout. Typically, a patrol aircraft would downgrade maybe to 2 and 4, something like that. Missions depend, because airplanes aren't the only things to have air hours. Missiles do too. They can only be carried so long before either they need to be refurbished or scrapped. So if you're just on a center patrol, it would make very little sense to have all 10 missiles on board. But it could, if ever needed. That kind of gets into its anti-bomber configuration, So what else? I don't know, it's just a big missile-carrying aircraft. This, of course, is the air superiority version. Early on, you really don't see them fitted with them, but they could carry dumb bombs, just iron bombs, 100, 250 kilogram, up to 500 kilogram bombs. And it could also carry rocket pods, but you don't really see this. It's a fighter, an escort at this time. It's more expensive and more time consuming to produce than the MiG, and it shows. We had over 1,600 MiG-29s built. We had about 680 Su-27s built over the years. But it's a different aircraft. And after the teething problems had been worked out, it really did start to make a name for itself. By the way, the rear here was ECM equipment, chaff, flare dispenser, the usual stuff you'd expect. So, that's kind of gets us up to the end of the Soviet Union. And Sukhoi was already planning all kinds of variants, but they would pretty much all have to wait, at least past the prototype stage, until the economy recovered and started seeking export customers. And this is when we start to see Sukhoi really, surpass MiG. By the way, eons ago, 2004, 2005, I was actually by the Sukhoi factory in Russia. Fun fact. Anywho, let's get this off the stand and move on. One thing, and most everyone around here is very polite, but I just wanted to make it clear for those who don't. This is not a political statement. This isn't a pro-war thing at all. The war in Ukraine is devastating to the Ukrainians, of course, the people, and it's also devastating to Russia and the Russian people. Whenever there's a war like that, it's never the politicians that end up paying the price. It's people that have their livelihoods wiped out, their savings, or their fathers or sons sent off to a war, or fighting a war down the street, It's a sad thing. So this is not a pro-war video. This is a look back at Cold War and 21st century history with the utmost respect. That's why I always wanted to be sure to include a Ukrainian 27, because it's just as much about the Sukhoi and Ukrainian service as it is Russian. And of course, service in others like China too. No, I love history, and I also love mechanical things. So it's not the violence that intrigues me, it's the mechanics. It's also why I love my NASA planes. Whenever there's a NASA logo plane, I always pick it up because it's the pure technology without the destructive ability. On the other hand, I do recognize that conflict happens, and fighting in one's defense, defending one's home, family, beliefs is very respectable. And so fighting for defensive purposes, 100% there for. But being aggressive, trying to take what doesn't belong to you, then you're just an ass. Named Putin. So anyway, let's move on with the video. I just want to give that disclaimer, and all respect to those who have suffered because of this war, which has gone on for almost a year and a half now. Tragic. So, with the baseline model out of the way, which variant to talk about first? I decided to go with the navalized version. And I also wanted to say that, while getting MiGs, especially the lesser known ones like the MiG-23, 17, 19, and 1/72 scale die-cast is not always easy. The Sukhoi, we have a lot of makers. I think part of it is it's attractive to the makers because they can use the same basic tooling to make all kinds of different versions. And also maybe because they're modern aircraft, maybe Sukhoi is easier to get licensing for. I don't know. This one's from Hobby Master, and generally I think they're our best bet, frankly. But I did also bring out an Air Force One. This is actually the Chinese J-15 reverse engineered variant, because I wanted to show a few features that the Hobby Master doesn't have when we get to it. But generally, yeah, I like the Hobby Masters, and they give a complete line. Now, of course, this might look very similar at first, and it is. The idea for a naval variant goes all the way back to the 70s. At that time, the Yak-38 was Russia's planned premier carrier-based fighter. But the Yak-38 had a lot of shortcomings. Not to mention, it was just short-ranged completely. And Russia was planning on building a number of carriers, at least 4. But they weren't sure how to do it. They were considering steam catapults. Then they tried a few different ramp systems. They finally kind of settled on the ski slope style around 1982. And since the initial Sukhoi program is kind of hitting the end of its design stage, they turned their attention to trying to get a contract for a carrier-based version. And their first proposal, known as the T-10K, that's the first prototype, the production will be known as the Su-27K, was shown off to the powers that be around 1984, and while they were encouraging, they said it needed to go on a weight loss plan. It needed to go on a diet. So a lighter weight version was developed, and basically by 85 they had the plans down. 86 they were working out the details. They got the first tooling up, and in 1987 the first prototype, that T-10K, flew. It wasn't a full K model. It didn't have all the features, but proof of concept. And luckily it didn't crash. So they would keep working on it, kind of giving all full features. In 1989, Russia's first aircraft carrier, at least of any note, the Admiral Kuznetsov, would first launch. And if you're about the type, actually that wasn't its name in 1989. I know, but try to keep things relatively simple. So good on you. And with it available, at least nominally so, in November of that year, the Su-27K pre-production type did the first test landings. And then in 1991, the Navy started practicing training on the carrier with the plane. We're still in pre-production era. This is obviously at the end of the Soviet Union, and things will slow down. Training, practice, development running through 94. And the aircraft would have its first cruise from the end of 1995 into 1996 on the Kuznetsov, but it would not actually be officially adopted into Russian Naval Aviation Service until August of 1998. It had been known as the Su-27K up until this point. They had built about 7 pre-production versions plus a prototype or 2, and it would be adopted, and Sukhoi would start marketing it under a new scheme to try to get international attention as the Su-33K, which, makes sense, trying to make it sound more modern. And an order would be placed. Initially, they were going to pick up 72 of these because they needed to equip 3 to 4 carriers. However, with budget cuts, the 3 other carriers were downsized. In fact, one of them would end up in the hands of China, which long ago I actually did a video on. So they only had 1 carrier. Now, they did want to fly some of these from naval bases for patrol and whatnot, so it's okay to have a few extras, but the order was reduced down to 24. And they would end up with 22 full production models, and they would have 2 of their pre-production models updated to full manufacturing standard. So, how does the Su-33K differ from the Su-27S? Overall length is slightly more. We do have a larger wing surface area, although the actual wingspan is the same. And we have canards here for additional lift, short takeoff, landing. And because these could not launch with full fuel, and they had to burn quite a bit getting off the deck, it was equipped with an aerial refueling probe. So basically, these would take off as lightly loaded as they could get away with, burning their fuel, and then they would meet up and link up. And thanks to this, its overall range isn't that much decreased from the standard model. Its performance isn't much either. It did have a somewhat improved AL-31F3 engine, a little more oomph to it, again for carrier purposes. Maximum altitude is slightly reduced to about 56,000 feet. Max speed is reduced. Some sources say Mach 1.8, some say Mach 2. In that range, you get the idea. But overall, it's not a huge compromise. We still have the 30mm cannon, and we still have weapons carriage ability. The initial Su-27 could carry about 17,000 pounds in ordnance. This downgraded that to about 15,000 on paper, but in reality, rare ever would these take off from a naval deck, even halfway loaded up. But the only time you might see one more or less loaded was from a shore base. Still a single seat, of course, and still has the limited air-to-surface abilities. And the first and only production batch would be delivered quite rapidly, and that's it. Sukhoi would build a total of about 35. The others were for potential foreign customers, show off demo planes. India, they almost had India ready to buy, but it didn't happen. So that was the production run, frankly. And this was really Sukhoi's first and last attempt at a naval-based fighter. I guess it was more successful than it could have been, but in the end, not as successful as they'd hoped. This was one of the first to have 12 hard points. We have 2 more under the wings. We have S8 rockets here. We have 1 R-27 each on the wing and 2 R-73s. I left the tunnel and engine cowlings empty. This is about as loaded up as you're ever going to see them for types of strike missions. And that's also why I wanted to bring out our Air Force One, because there are a few other things. For example, to operate from a carrier deck, the airframe was strengthened and the landing gear was strengthened. I'm going to set you down. And we went to a larger double front gear. This is pretty common for naval aircraft. And of course we have a tail hook, large tail hook in the back. And we have folding wings that the Air Force One does feature. And the Hobbymaster does not. The reason Hobbymaster says they don't do that is they don't want to have a seam, a gap. I appreciate that. I think it's also because they didn't want to redo the tooling completely. There's obviously the point for the hinge there. But it would be nice if this did fold, I'm not going to lie. So the Air Force One does. That's one reason I picked it up. Actually, my Chinese planes are mostly Air Force One because they tend to make a lot of the Chinese designs that others don't. My starboard ring is actually quite nice. My port wing is, you can see it's got a little bit of a gap there. It's just, the back's good, the front droops down a bit. But what can you do? Yeah, this one's good. That's how it came. It's not damaged. It's just how it was. So you can kind of see why Hobbymaster didn't want to do it. Yeah, big aviation wing there. And these come with the ordnance already on them, so that's why there's so many on this one. And they're also Chinese. But typically you would not see that. So, what about the Su-33's military combat service? It took nearly a dozen years from prototype till it was finally accepted for service, and it almost saw no combat. It was on board the Admiral Kuznetsov and being rotated around bases, but in 2009 it was decided to not order any more, to basically wear the ones they had out and replace them with the MiG-29K. This is one of the few successes MiG has had with Russia in recent times, and one of the times that MiG has actually bested. And it makes sense. The MiG is a smaller aircraft. It's kind of like comparing an F-14 size plane to, say, an F-18 Hornet. Makes sense, especially for Russia's smaller carrier. So that's the idea. We're going to buy those and just kind of let that. At this time, they have 19 operational Su-33s. However, this decision was reversed in 2015. The Naval Aviation Board said that they were going to actually send 20 aircraft back, in batches, to be upgraded and refurbished for further service. They would, give them some new avionics. They would give them satellite tracking, navigation. They would improve their ability to hit ground targets. We're not really going to smart weapons yet, still, dumb bombs, as it were, but they would improve the sighting system, give it a better computer for calculating trajectories. Little changes like that. Honestly, not huge things, just refurbishing planes that had not only been in service for 15 years, but also in the sea. It's kind of a harsh environment. So they started sending them back for refurbishment, and as it turns out, the timing was good. For in 2016, after years of waiting, the Sukhoi Su-27 and the Admiral Kuznetsov would finally be called upon for combat. And so here's a alternative model from Hobbymaster, 2016, Syria. So this would have been after the refurbishment and somewhat update. The carrier would be sent there as a force protection, and let's be honest, a PR thing. On November 15, they would take off from the deck, striking ISIL, Islamic terrorist targets, recruiting areas, training grounds, storage depots, munitions manufacturing areas, and they would be using their air-to-ground abilities with the improved precision. Still not laser, of course, but better. Using 500 kilogram, 1,100 pound bombs. And there are versions that are seen with the ECM pods on the wingtips. Others seem to have air defense missiles loaded up. This one here I do definitely have in a rather unrealistic payload, but just for fun, because taking off from the deck of the Kuznetsov, you first couldn't have full fuel. Typically in the air-to-air defense role, these are just carry 4, maybe 6 missiles, a couple of R-73s, a couple of R-27s. But for the ground attack, like I said, they would have either rocket pods, like the B-8, the S-8 we saw on the other one, or the CAB 500 bomb, or one of its variants. I also put some FAB 100s under the fuselage. Little 100 to 120 kg bombs. Just to kind of show you what it could carry. So what they could do if they wanted to load it up some, they could take off with the carrier, light fuel, meet, and refuel in the air and go to their targets. And they did strike targets on multiple missions. They're credited with destroying several structures, disrupting operations, and killing at least 30 rebels, terrorists, whatever you want to call them. The Syrian government definitely considers them terrorists. But of course, that wouldn't last. On December 5, Su-33 would take off from the deck, and it would plummet into the ocean. And the pilot would eject safely, so that's good for him. From that point, they would continue to operate the Su-33, but it would be from shore bases, forward bases, which, frankly, they should have done from the beginning. Its ground attack ability was always minuscule, even after the updates. This was meant to be an air superiority fighter to protect the Kuznetsov and other naval assets, and frankly, it was a political thing. They wanted to show that it wasn't just the U.S. and the U.K. that could move carriers around. Unfortunately, the Russian carrier has had many problems and gone to port, and billows out smoke like no one's business, so it's kind of a mixed bag as to what it's really telling people. Either way, operating in Syria. In the 2017, there was also talk about upgrading the engines, still using the Saturn type engine, just going to a somewhat improved version. And from there has been talk about further improvements and compatibility with new weapons, new jamming pods. In 2020, they announced that the Su-33 would remain in service through at least 2025, and that another round of refurb and updates would be conducted. And last year, there were reportedly 18 in service, although some sources say the number that are actually available that are fully flight-worthy are more like 10 or 11. The MiG-29K in a lot of ways is better. It's a smaller, lighter aircraft. It has more modern, especially ground attack abilities, better jamming, somewhat smaller radar cross-section, but it's not quite as agile, and it definitely doesn't have the range of the Su-33, which itself isn't known for great range, but since it could take off from the deck with more fuel on board, because of being a lighter aircraft, we'll see. The MiG-29K does seem to kind of trump the Su-33, but they're hanging on to it as much as they can. But yeah, I just thought I'd dress this one up here. It's a post-update version with the Syrian camo scheme. I've got 6 air-to-air defensive missiles on board. Like I said, a couple of 500 kg bombs, and then a dozen 100 kg. It would never really probably fly unless it was from a shore base. So you could also say, from that. At that point, it's pretty much as capable as another issue. But I just wanted to show it, have a little fun here. Hobby Master is supposed to have another couple of 2016/2017 Syrian models coming out next year. So what do you think? It's an interesting fighter. I recognize that it is not perfect, far from it. And I recognize that its use in Syria was minuscule, frankly, or at least its impact was nominal. It was a political thing, a PR thing more than anything else, but you have to admit, after having it in the fleet for years, anyone would want to finally let it out and stretch its legs. And you can't really blame Russia for wanting to try to operate a carrier, because that puts a nation in an exclusive club. Only about half a dozen in the world. And of course, with China now fielding a couple of carriers, even Japan getting back into the game, it makes Russia's naval assets more important than ever, although they never really did specialize in carriers. They were more the submarine fleet in the Cold War, which explains why these kind of always had secondary, priority. But anyway, just thought I would show that quite quickly. As for that Air Force One J-15, I've done other videos in the past on the Chinese variant. You can check those out, and maybe one day I'll do an updated video as well. With that, I think it's time to move on to another Sukhoi, and one that has, after a couple of false starts, proven more successful than the 33 at the very least. So the single-seat fighter was the Flanker B, also the P version for the PVO. The naval single-seat version was the Flanker D. What about the C? Well, that would be our first twin-seater of this video, but not our last. And I am not putting this one on the spinny thing because these JC stands are one of those. In some ways they're pretty cool, otherwise they're very wiggly wobbly. I don't know why they give it kind of this T-shaped base. If it had another thing back here, it'd be a lot better. It's kind of a neat concept, the stand. Anywho, this is an early example, at least in terms of features, of what we would know as the Su-30. And this has an interesting path. In the 80s, Sukhoi made the Su-27 UB, a two-seater intended for training, although it was capable of mounting weapons, much like the MiG-29UB. Well, in the mid-80s, the PVO was needing a longer-ranged, better endurance interceptor that could also, in a pinch, serve as an airborne command post. So basically, it needed to have a two-seat version, so you have a second guy to do things. They started with the Su-27UB, and Sukhoi would develop a concept which was pretty much just a lightly modified UB. It would fly in 1987. It worked out, so they made two actual prototypes. The first of those would fly the last day in 1989, and from there they would make three pre-production models, which would fly in 1992. These would be known as the Su-27 PU. So basically the Su-27, adding a U to it. And it really is the same aircraft for the most part. It's still 72 feet long, 48-foot wingspan. It does have aerial refueling capability on internal fuel, because this does have the somewhat altered, more fuel-efficient AL-31FL engines. It could do about 4.5 hours of flight, but with aerial refueling, that could be extended to nearly half a day, giving it very good range. It was, again, just pretty well standard. It had an improved radar system. It had 12 hard points for the standard R-27, R-73 missiles initially. Some types of strike capabilities, communications with the ground. That was the Su-27 PU again. This one's a little bit later than it. And the PVO would order 5. They would be delivered in 1994 and 1996. And the plan was to order more and make a regiment, a squadron. But because of budget cuts and changing needs, they didn't. The 5 would continue on in service, eventually being transferred to an aerobatics team in the early 21st century, because they couldn't really do much with just 5 of one type of fighter. So that could have been the end of the whole thing. Again, this stand is weird. It makes me nervous. But for a long time, the JC Wings is the best way we could do this. And they're not a bad die-cast model. They have the usual features: gear up or down, ordnance, opening canopy, moving parts, sometimes more than even a hobby master, like the tail back here moves. Maybe moves a little too easily, frankly. But what Sukhoi was doing at this time, they were really courting international customers. In fact, there were 2 variants. And as I said with the 33, they made a new naming system, and the 2-seat version like this became the Su-30. And for China, Vietnam, Indonesia, there was one variant, the Su-30 MKK and MK2. But for India, who had been a big customer for Russia, they made the Su-30 MKI, which was more directly based on the Su-27 UB and PU. And the Russian Air Forces actually really took a shine to the MKI, made for India. And so they requested that it be slightly altered to work with Russian equipment, weapons, and basically just communications and whatnot. And thus the Su-30 SM was born, with some concepts, and of course the Indian version being flown. And then in 2012 the first order for 30 was placed. Later that year the first production model would fly, and then towards the end of the year another 30 were ordered. And already by 2015 they were starting to take delivery, because this is a pretty traditional design, and the Russian naval services and the Russian naval air forces would also place smaller orders. And the first 60 were nearly delivered in 2016, when another 30 were ordered, and Naval Aviation ordered another half dozen or so as well, meaning that by 2018 it had officially entered into full service, and the VKS was sporting over 90, nearly, it'll be soon well be over 100, and Naval Aviation had about 20. And so it's a good transition here. Like I said, this is the early version that would have been 90s, 2000, even if JC Wings is confused on what they call it. They actually call this the Su-30MK Flanker C, which I guess is technically correct. So they don't even call it a SM, which would be the Russian specific design. Luckily, Hobby Master got us covered. So here we have a true 21st century Russian VKS built version. Obviously, the canards jump out at you as a difference in the airframe. There are some other small updates to the design. It can carry up to about 18,000 pounds in ordnance. Its ground attack ability has been expanded over time. Like I said, this was the Flanker C. Versions meant for like Vietnam, Indonesia, or designated by NATO as the Flanker G. The Russian version here, the SM, would be Flanker H. And really the first combat they would see in September of 2015, 4 would be sent to Syria, where they would serve as escorts, air superiority, kind of a combat air patrol fighters, with a secondary role as bombers. And they would be carrying various ordnance, usually unguided munitions. In fact, the early versions, that's pretty much what you had to go with. By the end of that year, there were 16 in theater, and they would continue to serve there in 2016, so that's what the 33 would be joining. And that's why when they went into full service after a good bit of testing in 2018, we will see a regimen of changes coming. Although Russia said that they did actually perform quite well. In fact, they didn't even suffer a single loss until 2018, when one was lost when it malfunctioned upon takeoff and then crashed. Russia said that its reliability record was meeting or exceeding expectations. Not bad for a little bit of an ad hoc aircraft. I mean, it was based initially on a 2-seat trainer, then a Soviet-era interceptor, and then something kind of copied from a foreign design. But it is a step forward. It's basically just giving a second person in there. Like I said, a little bit of an altered radar, a little more endurance thanks to the aerial refueling and slightly more efficient engines. Slightly lower max altitude compared with the fighter version, but still can really get up there. Same when it goes to speed. It's a little bit slower top speed for efficiency purposes, but still Mach 2, so perfectly fine. Capable aircraft. They consider it a Generation 4 plus at this point, but then there would be the next round of updates. First tested in 2020 with the first production models delivered later that year. Some would be all new airframes, others would be refurbished and updated existing airframes. We would have what was first known as the Su-30 SM1 project. Soon, for clarity and for PR reasons, this was known as the Su-30 SM2. Same thing, just early versus later name. And NATO would usually call this the Flanker J. And it basically has new engines. It's the Su-41F engine, and it has the new radar system. We're going to see these again. They're from other projects that Sukhoi's been working at. By the way, the Su-30 did have a version of thrust vectoring as well. It had a new computer and guidance system, new avionics, again, so it could work with a wider range of air-to-surface guided munitions like the KH-29, the KH-31, both versions, even the 59, so on and so forth. But it still primarily would use the CAB series of bombs and whatnot. But, you know, expanding its ground attack ability, because while it started off as a long-range interceptor, air superiority fighter, by this point it's a true multi-role fighter, if not even more of a ground attacker, because it's a good plane, but it is a little bit of aging technology. Although Sukhoi insists on considering the updated version as a Generation 4++. Wonder how many pluses they can add. Anyway, deliveries have been taking place ever since. As of last year, the VKS had around 92 of the 30 SMs and about 20 of the updated SM2s, and the Navy had about 22, 23 SMs with about 20 SM2s on order. So, well over 100 in service, making it one of the more common modern aircraft in both. And of course, it would see use in Ukraine after the war began in 2022. In fact, it would be a frontline fighter and escort vessel, along with another one we'll talk about, and it was credited with up to half a dozen air-to-air victories, although it wouldn't be long before one would be lost in Ukraine, because it was operating on the front line and being flown so many hours. Losses would quickly mount in 2022, some through just accidents, it happens in combat, some unknown causes, but others would be shot down, and still others would actually be destroyed while on the ground, attacking air bases and whatnot. So, not really the plane's fault, but that's combat. And to some extent, it did start to kind of show its age. For example, its radar system, it's not at all stealth or low visibility, but it's very good endurance and very cost-effective nature, not just to buy, but also to maintain. These didn't cost a ton of rubles, and so probably something they will continue to operate for a number of years. I mean, heck, they're still receiving new ones and refurbished ones. But yeah, I think it's kind of neat how a two-seat trainer turned into quite an advanced version in the family, and one that internationally has been very successful for Sukhoi. They've actually built almost as many Su-30s, all variants and types, as they have the Su-27. Like I said, they built about 680 27s. They've built 630 Su-30 types, of all types. So, pretty neat. As far as the models, yeah, the Hobbymaster is clearly better, more durable. It's the newer design. I'm not going to dog the JC wings for a long time. This is all we had. And for an early version, it works. I just wish the stand was a little more stable. Oh well. Have you ever owned one of these JCs? Let's see if I can slip it off the stand. I mean, it hooks in really good at the engines. I'll give it that. There we go. They really aren't bad. I'm not going to dog on them. It's heavy. Metal. The ordnance is removable. Certainly a step up from Air Force One. But what I found about this whole thing, the JCs, whatever plastic they use is just more rigid and thin and more fragile. Hobby Masters, what they make theirs from, it can take a ding. It can take a bit of a bend and go back to shape. What they use here just doesn't. Oh well. Thought about removing these missiles. I don't think these are correct for an earlier one, because this is really before they were doing multi-roll, but it's what it came with. They're not glued on, I believe. No, they just come off. I thought I put them on. That's what they came with. But these days, Hobby Master continues to expand their line, so if you're looking for an issue 30, I would definitely recommend those. I also noticed that Herpa is doing one, and Air Force One does one as well. Again, it's pretty easy to find Sukhois in this scale, and that's a cool thing. One benefit, this one actually has a hinged canopy, whereas the Hobby Masters is a sectional one where you swap it open or closed. This one actually pulls up and opens, so that's kind of neat. Pilots inside. Alrighty, well, this kind of is a good crossing over point from the first generation of Sukhois to the modern second generation. Up to this point in the video, we've mostly focused on Russian Su-27s and variants, but Ukraine has also been a major user of the aircraft, at least the original version, since the beginning. And that's why with the current war, you have Su-27s on both sides, which can sadly lead to friendly fire incidents, but such is war. In fact, really the first regiment, the first unit to receive production Su-27s back in the Soviet era in the USSR was stationed in Ukraine. That would have been at the end of 1985. And since that time, they continued to receive aircraft, with the final ones that they would end up getting after the breakup of the USSR in 1991. They would end up with 70 or more just there, as part of their deal. We talked about in the MiG video how Kazakhstan ended up with 50 of the MiG-31s. Same deal here. So they inherited a good chunk. Of course, Russia would inherit more, over 300, including variants and things since then. But basically, a tenth of production would end up with Ukraine. And not bad, considering what a modern, updated fighter it was. And since this was really just coming onto the scene at the end of communism, not as many nations at that time would deploy this large range air superiority, later multi-role fighter. So that kind of put Ukraine in good stead, but there were problems. This model here from Hobby Master is from the Ukrainian Air Force. I thought it was worth having. Picked it up a year or two ago, I guess a couple years ago now, really before the whole war thing kicked off. But my other one we looked at is an early version. This is a more standard production version. And there are some differences, probably most notable on camera. The vertical stabilizers are different. Also, the extension boom in the back that is different. A few other small details, but really just that'd be fun to have a Ukrainian one. So, of course, the specs would be the same for the planes. They would operate 10 points. Like the early fighter versions, carriage of about 10,000 pounds. Of course, later versions would up that quite rapidly. Same speed and everything. So Ukraine had them in the 90s, but the Air Force did not have much of a budget. And the Su-27 is more expensive to operate and maintain compared to, say, the MiG-29. Also, since it was so new, they didn't get a lot of spare parts and whatnot. Although they did end up with a couple of aircraft refurbishment facilities and other maintenance facilities, again inherited from the Soviet Union, so it wasn't all bad. They did have some technology there for maintaining these if they could, fund it. This meant that out of the 70 some odd they ended up with, most weren't flying. They would keep a couple of squads flying. In fact, the situation was desperate enough that between about 2007 and 2016-17, Ukraine would sell off a number of aircraft to foreign customers, including around 7 or 8 Su-27s. And after relations with Russia really fell apart starting around 2008-2009, their access to new technology and fresh parts from Sukhoi in Russia declined, and therefore their fleet actually dropped down a good bit. In fact, before the invasion of Crimea in 2014, they were flying fewer than 20 of these. Some between 15 and 20 were in service. But at the time, Ukraine wasn't prioritizing its Air Force because per treaty, going way back to 97, 2004, 2007, it was actually Russia who was supposed to basically protect Ukraine from foreign invasion. So they were supposed to leave them free to dedicate their economy to other things. But it started to become clear that was, anyway. So we do get a bit of an upgrade program from Ukraine known as the Su-27, and then we will add an 1M. They had a few versions. For example, the 27S would become the 27S1M. They had some of the PVO versions, so 27P, and they also updated a few of the UB two-seaters. Not a huge and extensive upgrade, it was still very necessary. In 2012, the Ukrainian aircraft company kind of worked out a plan to update and modernize the fleet, especially those in mothball. Part of it was just standard refurbishment, repair, things that sit around. That's Part of it was also to bring these more in line with NATO standards. They would slightly improve and update the radar systems, also some of the countermeasures. They did a little more work to the communications, like the radio, and a very small amount of tweaking to the weapons systems, but not a whole lot. And that's kind of what we're saying, just, kind of going through, replacing old seals and things, doing little improvements that we could. In the beginning, there wasn't really any funding for this, but funnily enough, after the invasion of Crimea, the government voted to fund the Air Force better, which led to contract to update the fleet. And so orders were placed in 2014, with the first couple of aircraft delivered in 2016. And by the time 2019 rolled around, they had 34 aircraft in flyable condition, most in the new 1M standard. So they're pulling them out, refurbishing them. Over the Crimean incident, in the beginning they did scramble these to fly over the Black Sea, but there wasn't much for them to do, so they didn't really make much of an impact. It is worth pointing out that Ukraine did lose a couple to accidents and what have you over the years, but they still had a couple of dozen more in inventory that could be brought back out. And that kind of sets us up for the war that began February of 2022. These would play a much larger part then. They would be scrambled pretty much the day of and used for aerial patrols, CAP missions, escort missions, also interdiction of unknown or civilian aircraft, and of course challenging Russian aircraft. They were used heavily, and they would start to suffer losses pretty much immediately. Several would be lost between the end of February and September of 2022, and of course ongoing. But it wasn't one-sided. Many shot down drones, many others interdicted or pushed back Russian aircraft attempts. And you did have some even ground strike missions. The Snake Island incident, May 7, is pretty famous. A couple of these just came in low and fast and dropped some ordnance. I don't know exactly what they dropped there, but it would probably just unguided, because this is still the original 27 standard, so it could use unguided bombs, rockets, that kind of thing. Quite famously, in September last year, pictures revealed them armed with anti-radiation missiles, HARM, the AGM-88s, which are obviously Western missiles, and people were kind of wondering how in the hell these would work on old communist block-era aircraft, but they worked because the miracle of modern computing. So they were being used in the Seed mission role, Wild Weasel role, which would make perfect sense. And I'm a big fan of Wild Weasel aircraft. If Hobby Master ever does a Wild Weasel Ukrainian 27, I'd have to pick it up. And of course, they continue to fly this year, 2023, and some more losses, but also some victories. There's been some aces and famous people, and they're fighting for their homeland. And on the one hand, they don't have as many as Russia, and they don't have the latest Russian versions and stuff, but on the other, they have some. It's a good aircraft, especially in the defensive role, the patrol role. Yeah, this one here is still armed with the R-27s and the R-73s, which is the loadout we mostly see in pictures from Ukraine. Chances are they wouldn't have all 10 pylons, hardpoints filled up. Although, depending on the mission, you might get close to it. I'm not sure how many missiles Ukraine has either. They might be trying to conserve what they do have. But they did update theirs as much as they could. But years of low or almost no funding did hobble the Ukrainian Air Force. And, well, we see where we're at today. Of course, that story is ongoing. We don't know how many they have in service today, partially just because of losses, partially because of military intelligence. That information doesn't need to get out. But at any rate, the slightly modernized Ukrainian Su-27S1M. So, with that, what's Russia? What's the VKS doing? Well, they're doing more than just slightly modernizing. With limited funds and access to parts, Ukraine did the best they could updating the flanker. But they were also just really wanting to keep it as an air superiority fighter, just keeping it flying. It was almost more of a mid-life upgrade than a true modernization. But not so for Russia. This is the Su-27SM. And even though it looks very similar to the previous models, I don't know why this one delights me so much from Hobby Master. But it does, and they got a lot of the little details, little changes just really right with this. And this is pretty much what they're flying today. And Sukhoi considers this a Generation 4 Plus example, so it's kind of with the midlife of the Su-30SM program. Anyway, it actually goes back to China. Officially, China was the only export customer of the Su-27, again before the breakup of the USSR. These planes were just coming out then, so they had placed some contract orders in the 90s, and it was they who wanted them to be strengthened because they were wanting to deliver them with air-to-ground bombs, still unguided, but more capacity. Originally, like I said, the Su-27 could only carry about 9,700 pounds. But as we know from the Su-33 for the Navy, it could easily be improved with stronger landing gear, stronger frame, hard points to carry well over 10,000. Depending on the variant, you're looking at anywhere from 14 to 16, give or take. So that was done for the Chinese. This also required a little bit of tinkering with the radar for better detection of ground targets, but we're still, unguided ordnance at this point. That third and last contract was signed at the tail end of 1999, and so Russia would deliver about 76 of the somewhat improved Su-27 SK and also the two-seat B or UBK to China. This would actually ultimately lead to China having a production license and the J-11B, but that's a story for another video. But it did get Sukhoi thinking. It's about time for a new Su-27. They're starting this new product line with the Su-30 and trying to modernize their marketing. So why not do that for more of a budget-minded customer? And since this is the modern era, we need more multi-role capability. Air superiority is just not as important in the early 21st century. So they make a prototype, and it first flies at the tail end of 2002, and it's shown off to the world at a Moscow air show in the summer of 2003. And coincidentally, this is about when the Russian government's coming out of an economic slump, and so funding is being unlocked to update, modernize, refurbish the military. So in 2004, the Russian Air Force, and to a lesser extent Navy, sought to update its flanker fleet. And so, that's where this comes from. Basically, it is an updated multi-role capability aircraft. And the first 24 updated Su-27Ss were delivered back to the VVS in 2006 as the first run, the first generation of Su-27SMs here. Some changes were internal. For example, this is true full digital fly-by-wire. The cockpit was updated with the flat screen color displays, whereas before, the old school monochrome. You did have updated electronic countermeasures. It could take newer pods, jamming pods, updated chaff and flare dispensers, other avionics. And it was improved to work with the new, at that time not out yet, and even today kind of debatable, again story for another video, R-77 missile. But it was given that capability. As it happens, the Chinese contract planes, except for maybe the last few, were not. Again, modern tech. The radar, the avionics and everything were also updated for better detection of ground targets, as well as maritime ship targets. And for the first time, it could actually use guided, smart bombs or guided missiles. Therefore, it had to have an updated system. It could carry a targeting pod. The IRST was updated. The infrared systems, all that was updated to allow this to fulfill that role. And because of the stronger airframe and gear, it could carry more payload, so on and so forth. Pretty nifty. But we have the carriage of still 10 hard points, what have you. There would be a second contract delivered around 2009 for another 24. And again, the Navy is having some of theirs updated, but they seem to be trailing behind. And Russia had flown their Su-27s over Georgia way back in 91, 92, 93, right after the end of the USSR, but again, they're air superiority fighters. In 2008, they would get the first chance to fly some updated versions there and maybe kind of analyze the ground attack ability, what have you, and the multi-role capabilities in some limited numbers. Also, China would order a new batch, but this would ultimately be canceled, and so in 2011 the Russian Air Force would get a dozen new production, not upgraded, but new production Su-27s, flankers. And this is actually important for our story. These would have further strengthened airframes. They can carry up to 3 tons more total takeoff weight, which translates to more payload. They also had 2 additional hardpoints under the wings, much like the Su-33 and the Su-30. And they could carry even newer ordnance and weapons. And they had upgraded engines. They had the AL-31 FM1 engine for more thrust. They would also have fully glass cockpit with multifunction displays. By this point, even with the older SMs, they had a helmet-mounted targeting system, but it's further improved. Yeah, basically they could just carry more, and they had more powerful engines. And these would be designated as the Su-27 SM3 standard. What was the SM2? Some sources say it was actually a name previously used for another aircraft we'll get to later. Others point out that it was actually just kind of an interim step, maybe for the second batch of updated aircraft that had slightly upgraded AL-31F engines and the kind of next generation avionics suite. Either way, transitional step. You don't really hear much about it. As far as standards, we either go from the SM to the SM3. Also, NATO reports the updated versions as Flanker E, because, why wouldn't they? And then the updated version, the SM3 standard, is referred to as the Flanker J. And sometimes it's Flanker J modified. Yeah. But this is really kind of pushing the envelope. One thing it did not have that the Su-30 does is aerial refueling. The Su-30 needed it because of its long-range role. The Su-27 SM and the SM-3 did not, mostly because the Russian Air Force's VKS later on, aerospace, did not request it. So, hey, if they didn't order it, they didn't need it. And that, that's fine. They had the 30 anyway. So initially, this had about twice the ground attack capability. By the SM3 standard, we have easily 3 times the ground attack capabilities with newer weapons, the KH-29, KH-31, and we can use the R-77 if the Russian military ever gets enough to matter. We still have the old 30mm cannon. The cockpit is much easier, better situational awareness for the pilot, easier to control. Updated, more secure digital communication systems come into play. And again, it can use the newer ECM pods, jammer pods. It's pretty cool. I just like it. And this one here, we do see the R-77s under the wings, and we see 2 strike weapons. And it's starting to show kind of that conformity in the Russian fleet at this point. By 2012, it's estimated that about half of the flankers in the VKS were to an updated standard. And in 2014, before the invasion of Crimea, they were showing about 70 updated in the inventory, as well as about 200 older models, 27S, 27P. They had about 50 UB 2-seaters. The Navy itself had about 50, little more flankers in service. You get to the one number is technically how many serials are on the books, but some of them aren't flyable. Some of them are just put into storage for reserves, but, active. Kind of gives you an idea. They go in. In 2015, they would send a regiment, a squadron of the new SMs to Syria, where they would be used for close air support, escort missions, and still flying CAP missions. They're still a good air superiority fighter. It's just now they can either deliver a lot of heavy dumb bombs or still a decent number of smart bombs and guided missiles. And we can do anti-radiation. We can do seed missions with the variant of the KH-31. Another variant of the KH-31 is a anti-shipping missile. The KH-29 is what I always think of as a bunker buster. I'm probably wrong on that, but you get the idea, ground attack. And the new radar systems, in addition to having ground tracking modes, it has slightly longer range than the original flanker radar, but really it's just faster processing, more efficient processing, because we're using 21st century computers versus late Soviet era computers. And they would continue to receive planes. They'd send older ones to Sukhoi for update, get them back. It was relatively quick. They would sometimes get new production as well, and they would continue to fly these throughout the era. And then when we get into 2021, right before the invasion of Ukraine, they're operating roughly 100 Su-27 SMs on the front line. A couple of years earlier, the SM-3 was considered the new standard, so most have been updated to that, but not all. I mean, the SM's still perfectly good, so it gets a little complicated into which planes get what. Again, the Navy's still flying a couple of squadrons as well. And I don't know how many new airframes they'll get. They may just, use up what they've got. Still, though, not bad considering the age of the aircraft. And of course, as I said on the Ukrainian section, they're flying these over there as well. One difference, though, obviously Ukraine is flying theirs as a fighter because they're defending their homes. Although they do have some bombing missions like Snake Island. Russia can use them as a fighter. But since they have newer, better aircraft for air superiority, these are used more as fighter bombers, second line defense, escorts, things of that nature, and that's why we do see them often at least carrying a couple of air-to-ground munitions, be they smart or dumb. And they've flown. Of course, they've had losses, they've had successes. I mean, it's still a good plane, and not knocking Ukraine. They did the best they could updating theirs, but the Russian update is much more comprehensive and effective. And in a lot of ways, it's partially thanks to the Chinese pushing the design forward, the flanker design forward. I don't know why. I really do like this model. But this is really only like generation 1.5 for the Su-27. And Sukhoi, well, they took it much, much further. But before we move on, since we early in the video compared the original MiG-29 to the original Su-27 as air superiority, let's compare the upgraded fighter bomber multi-role versions. The Su-27 SM to the MiG-29 SMT we looked at in the previous video. Interestingly, the range is about the same now, and that's because the 27 does not have aerial refueling, and the SMT does. Plus, it has up to 3 external tanks, so the range is roughly about the same now. Top speed, same, really. The 29 may be a little more agile, maneuverable. Both get newer cockpits, and both are designed to carry essentially the new weapons. But the SU can carry more and heavier, where, like I said, about 16,000 pounds. Even with all the strengthening, the MiG-29 is still under 10,000. Also, the SM has 10 or 12 hard points. Now, yeah, the outer ones are just for the R-73, and I don't know how well the tunnel would work for some air-to-surface, but the MiG-29 has the same limitations. The outer ones are for the R-73, and if we do want external tanks, we only have the 2 middle pylons, so we can carry 2 air-to-surface munitions. And they do work. We've seen these used in the fighter-bomber role in places like Syria beginning in 2017. And usually you see the SM here, which is 2 as well, but theoretically you can carry up, 4 or even 6 different ordnance types. So, gotta give it there. It can carry more. On the other hand, the 29 can operate from shorter, rougher airfields closer to the front line. But of course, they only acquired, well, fewer than 50. A few new airframes and whatnot, and some updates, but, you know, there's not about half as many in service as these. And it doesn't seem like they're really going with the 29 direction, but it is interesting to see both updated for the new modern role. So I would say, yeah, the biggest advantage with the SU is the heavier payload and the more places to place the weapons. And both are kind of considered Generation 4 plus aircraft. But the plan now, at least on paper, is to replace the MiG-29 SMT with the MiG-35. But we'll see if that actually happens. Either way, these are multi-role fighters. What if you need a bomber? Well, Sukhoi thought of that too. So let's get into one of the most interesting and radical variants members of the family. While this aircraft is definitely part of the Su-27 lineage family, it is so different that it's no longer considered a flanker by NATO. Rather, it has the new reporting name of fullback, which actually fits it very well. This is the Su-34, sometimes also referred to as the Su-32, especially early on for export. That was when Sukhoi was doing the new naming conventions. And it borrows a little bit from everything. We're going to find elements from the Su-27 SM program and bits from the Su-30 and decidedly from the Su-33. This goes all the way back to the 1980s when the Soviet Air Forces were looking to replace the aging and relatively expensive to operate Su-24, the Fencer. Also maybe some Su-25 Frogfoots, but mostly the Strike Interdictor 24. So they considered doing what they did with the original Su-27P and going from that. But really, before anything could happen, the Soviet Union was on its way out. So it's a bit of a minor miracle anything happened here. Now, technically, we did have one prototype known as T-10V1 in 1990, but it was a far cry from what we would end up with here. We need to jump back to the Su-33, which I realize I might have said Su-33K a few times in this video. Oh well. Combining Su-27K and that. There was a planned two-seat version for naval use, like shore-based Navy, with more side-by-side seating versus tandem. And it would be known as the Su-27 Cub, KUB. This was the kind of the starting point for the new long-range strike fighter. And that first prototype would basically be a Su-27 two-seat K model. They'd change a few minor things, but yeah, basically it was a proof of concept, which we've seen them do more than once. 1991, of course, the USSR falls apart. There's kind of low-rate interest at Sukhoi. We actually see work in 1992. They will make a couple more prototypes. There'll be the 10V2 come out. We also see it shown off at a couple of air shows. They market it initially as the Su-27IB. It's meant to be a two-seat naval strike aircraft. And then in 1994 we get the version that more closely resembles this, especially with this extended stinger in the back, also the same stabilizers that would end up oops, that is the wrong end. See, this is why I like Hobbymaster. These Pytot tubes. And no, I'm not going to say pedo tube because YouTube will cancel me. are actually pretty durable on these. But, yeah, the stinger on the back here is what I meant to do. And so they do start marketing these, and Sukhoi hoped to have these in service by 1998. In 96, give or take, this is when the naming conventions change, and they first start marketing this as the Su-32FN, a naval-operated shore-based strike anti-shipping aircraft. Interest wasn't that high. They continue to make a few prototype pre-production models. Then they start marketing it as the Su-32MF, more of a multi-row naval or Air Force craft. And by this point, it's really starting to look as we see it here. And finally, the Russian powers that be, the Russian military, starts to take interest, but 98, 99, they just don't have the budget for it. Nevertheless, Sukhoi doesn't give up, but by 2003, they've only built a handful of models for showing off testing. By 2004, they've built a total of 8, including the initial prototypes. And finally, the Russian Air Forces decides it wants some. So in 2006, 5 of the pre-production models are transferred over to it. And these were actually used clandestinely in 2008 over Georgia, which actually would lead to some notes. Turns out the fullback here took so long to come into production that by the time it did, it was a little bit outdated, especially in terms of avionics, electronics. It wasn't quite able to detect small ground targets with the precision needed. So the Russian Air Force would place an order for 32 if they would do an improved radar and update it a bit for weapons carriage, something Sukhoi was perfectly happy to do. And deliveries would commence pretty much every year from 2008 up to 2015 on that contract, and therefore advanced testing would be conducted. There was a pretty historic long range, a 6,000 mile flight in 2010 with a pretty full payload of about 8,000 pounds. We had other weapons carriage testing and everything. It officially passed state trials in 2011, and then the first half dozen or so were handed over to combat unit in 2014, at which time it was considered operationally ready. So what is it? Definitely still a Sukhoi. It's longer, mostly thanks to the stinger, but also a wider nose. It's about 76.5 feet long. It does have greater wing area, but it's still just over 48 feet wingspan. It is a much heavier aircraft than previous, including having about 1,500 pounds of, about nearly 2 tons of armor, a lot of that being placed around the cockpit, kind of making a capsule to protect the crew, also around the fuel. It has the same 30mm cannon as before. It's been given 180 rounds, so 30 more than usual. We have the same AL 31 FM1 engines, the same ones we actually will see used in the Su-27 SM, which makes sense because it's pretty concurrent. We obviously see the canards used in either of these. And we have a total of 12 hard points underneath. Pretty standard weapons carriage, air-to-air missiles, but mostly for defense, although to be fair, it was marketed as a fighter, at least nominally so it could launch them. And actually, thanks to additional equipment in the rear here, it could technically fire a missile that would loop around and go behind it. So, kind of an interesting little feature. As far as the weapons loadout, 8,000 pounds is considered average, and full load was about 12,000. Some later versions might have been able to carry a little bit more than that. And as far as one individual piece of ordnance, up to about 4,000 pounds. It carries regular unguided bombs and rockets, pretty much all the smart bombs and rockets, and it can even carry cruise missiles. Remember, this was meant to replace the Su-24, so it really would have to. As far as its performance, because the intakes are fixed, and because of the extra weight, it's a little bit slower at about Mach 1.8. At sea level, it's still supersonic at about Mach 1.2 or just under. Max altitude is respectable at about 56,000 feet, a lot like the naval version there. And it's reasonably agile for what it is. And again, it does have pretty good electronics equipment. It was designed from the get-go to operate in an area of intense jamming or electromagnetic interference, so steps were taken for all that. It is quite different, but it does use the same engines and pretty much the same rear area as a lot of other Sukhois, even the wings very similar. But the cockpit at the front end is very, very different. From the outset, this was designed for long-range, long-duration missions. On internal fuel, even with a decent weapons load, it's capable of about 2,500 miles, but it's capable of aerial refueling. Like I said, a test mission early on did 6,000 miles. So, yeah. In that time, the crew is expected to get up and move around. We have the main pilot, commander in the left seat. We have the weapons officer, navigator in the right, but of course they can switch off relief. And something that I always have to mention whenever the full pack comes up is the accommodations for the crew inside. I don't know, I think it's just neat. First and foremost, the inside is actually tall enough there's headroom. A person could theoretically stand up. They also put a small galley area, as they call it, which basically is just some food packets and a way to heat them up and some water, hydration, that kind of thing. But at least there's a way to get something more than just like food from a tube, unlike, say, what U-2 or SR-71 pilots would have to go with. And of course, if you're going to feed and water your pilots, eventually, they're also going to need to, what goes in must come out. And therefore, it also has a small chemical type toilet. And finally, for those really long missions, at least in theory, there's enough room in the little hallway, walkway, that a person could throw down a sleeping bag and get some Z's. And if that's not enough, or if you can't get out of your seats, the chairs even have a vibrate feature in the back. I'd actually like to be inside one of these. It's kind of interesting. And just to kind of complete it, part of it is just the overall size. This is a giant plane. The regular Sukhoi is big. This is even bigger. And since this is an armored canopy, you actually enter through the front wheel well. There's a ladder that comes down up into it, and then of course when that comes up and seals, you have protection. The glass is of course reinforced against bullets, even small cannon fire. Pretty neat, just innovative. So the biggest differences are in the front, and again it has very advanced air-to-ground abilities, targeting, and is very good at aerial refueling because it was meant for from the beginning. And I just think it's interesting that it started off as a basis on the naval version and just grew from there. And even though it was a very slow start, orders have continued Even before it was officially put into full service in 2012, a large order for over 90 was placed with Sukhoi, and they were actually delivered all by 2020. They didn't deliver these in big lumps. Typically, the Air Force would get about 4 at a time, sometimes 2, sometimes 5, but 4 seems to be kind of the batch when you look at actual orders and deliveries. And it wouldn't be long before they saw combat. In September of 2015, the first 6 were sent to Syria, and the last day of that month, first day of October, they would go on their first bombing missions. And from there, we've seen a lot of service. This one here, I've just had fun arming up. We've got 4 really big bombs. We've got the guided missile. We also have a rocket pod. But we don't have our air-to-air missiles. Early on, because of political reasons, and there just wasn't really felt like an immediate threat, these were not going into theater with anything but air-to-ground attack munitions. Now, they did have ECM pods, which are what are on the wingtips here. Other Sukhois could mount similar pods too. But then an incident happened, and we do start to see a new configuration. Not the spaghetti incident, but the Oleg Peshkov incident. Like I said, half a dozen were in theater. They flew throughout October, and then in mid-November, they were joined by 8 more, which is about the strongest they would be. But just a few days later, on November 24th, during a mission, an Su-27 was shot down. And so, in response, a week later, Russia announced that going forward, all of its flights would be armed with air-to-air missiles for defense, which is what we have here. It has 2 R-73s, 2 longer-ranged R-27s, and yes, the Su-34 was cleared to carry the R-77, although we can debate how many would be around. Either way, it has more of an air-to-air loadout, still mostly for defense, but it would mostly still carry out ground attack missions. Continuing on, in the 2016, they would start to draw down the numbers a bit, and somewhere between 6 and 10 were around. The next year, they would go back up to about a dozen because they had a major operation planned for September, October, hitting what they considered a large ISIS or ISIL target. And then they would start to draw down again. Still flying, though. There would soon be a pretty famous incident where Russian-flown Su-34s would encounter Turkish-flown F-16s, forcing the F-16s to turn back. So they did have some air-to-air intimidation factor. And they continue to bomb targets. Their long-range, good endurance, heavy payload were all well respected. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. They did discover that a large proportion were often on the ground for routine maintenance or repair. It's a relatively complicated machine, so yeah, sometimes a lot of the aircraft weren't available. Also, there were a couple of incidences of mid-air collisions, especially 2018, 2019. Other accidents happened. And just in general, they were a little spendy to operate. Nevertheless, by the end of 2020, the VKS was reporting that they had 124 in inventory. So quite a large number. And they were able to justify this simply because they said years ago that 70 of the new Su-34s would let them retire 300 older aircraft, namely the Su-24. And even if this new planes cost money, cheaper to buy 70 new planes versus refurbishing, repairing older swing wing designs. The whole swing wing thing worked well for 60s, 70s technology. But with new modern digital computers, fly-by-wire, firmly fourth generation or fourth plus, it stopped really making sense. The Su-24, much like the F-14 or the F-111, or for that matter the MiG-23, as they had come and gone. Oh, and the Panavia Tornado. You just don't see variable geometry wing planes these days because, well, technology's moved on. It let them retire some Su-25s as well, but quite a few frogfoots are still fighting today because, much like the A-10 Warthog, it's hard for that type of plane to go out of style. But a strike, interdictor, attack, or even fighter aircraft like this needs to be kept up and modern. And it would be. This would be the first generation, and already they were looking, after so much combat experience in Syria and other places, how can we improve it, make it even better, more effective? So, they do this. Here we have the most recent, chronologically speaking, variant from Hobby Master. This is from the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainian war. And it's time to talk about the Su-34M. There had been plans to make an updated, modernized version for quite some time, but combat use in Syria and other places showed the strengths but also the weaknesses, some of which included the fact that this is not stealthy. There's no stealth abilities whatsoever. Also, it's always good to have updated communications equipment and access to new weapons. And there was always a desire, again, kind of going back a long ways, to make this not just a strike aircraft, attack aircraft, a bombing aircraft, but also to give it some recce capabilities, some recon. The Su-24 had a recon variant, the Su-24MR, which is still technically in service, so they're hoping to replace those. So they wanted to have it compatible with newer, more advanced reconnaissance pods, and they wanted it to be capable of acting as an electronic warfare aircraft, kind of like the EA-6 Prowler and the newer EA-18 Growler in America. And of course there's a variant for the Eurofighter as well. So yeah, work had been underway for some time. And in 2020, plans really started to get confirmed. In August of that year, an order for 24 new aircraft built to a newer standard was placed, and by the end of that year, 76 Su-34, so-called M variants, were on the board. The idea was, if we get enough of these, we'll have roughly 200 in service, and we can replace all the older Su-24s, including the reconnaissance planes, and several other planes besides, updating the fleet, and while at the same time having newer equipment. And the first of these were received for testing and trials in 2021, and really the first full production batches were being received in 2022. Actually, several batches. They still continue to deliver these in groups of 4, and they continue through this year. So what is the 34M? I decided to put this one in ground mode just so you can see the ladder under the cockpit where they climb up to. Because of the unique entrance and egress system, Hobby Master doesn't give an open canopy because really no such thing exists. And this one has a Ukrainian war loadout with 3 big weapons underneath, and then R-27s and R-77s for protection, plus it has ECM pods on the wings again. So what they did, there was standard avionics updates, communications updates, updates to the GPS system, which was actually greatly needed, update for a wider range of weapons, like we've already mentioned, just, expanding its abilities. Obviously, it has the ability to mount reconnaissance pods. It also has more of an open architecture now, so it can be upgraded more easily in the future. So that's good for them. And jamming and other electronic warfare stuff is expanded because, yeah, you're not really going to make this stealthy. And when it's fully loaded up on combat, its max speed is by necessity limited. And so traveling low and fast as a strike aircraft can only do so much. So yeah, it's meant to try to confuse and jam other weapons like anti-aircraft targeting it. Little things like that, and I'm sure there's plenty more changes on the drawing board, and I'm sure it won't just be all in one go. It'll be incremental updates, but it seems to be relatively straightforward because, again, they seem to usually transition from the original 34 to the 34M in the production line, and the newer ones will be built to 34M standard. And one would imagine that the older aircraft would be overhauled at some point, getting most, if not all, of the updates. And the idea, yeah, they hope to have this contract complete by the year 2027, which would allow them to retire the older aircraft as planned. And that gets us to February 2022, the eve of the war, the invasion of Ukraine. These were called upon quite heavily. There were 4 regiments fully equipped and trained on the Su-34, and from the get-go, they were used for precision strike missions, long-range missions, but also more traditional, just heavy bombing missions as well. And it wouldn't be long before the first Su-34 would be lost over Ukraine. It would be on February 28. And by the summer, reports were at least 10 had been lost. And by this year, we've had at least 20 confirmed losses. Now, it's not all to combat. Some could be accidents, other issues, and some are lost on the ground due to attacks. So they have taken quite a heavy toll, but they've also been employed heavily. So yeah, it's kind of reasonable. And they're coming in quite low, quite vulnerable to air defenses. And while it is a fast aircraft for what it is slower than an air superiority fighter. And even though it's relatively small for a bomber, it's really big for a fighter. So you're looking at something that might have as much as twice the radar signature of a MiG. And of course, there was a very famous friendly fire incident where Russian air defenses themselves shot down an Su-34. So yeah, that happened. And there has been people questioning this. And I get it. And kind of downplaying its role in Ukraine. And I have to admit, I think some of that is a bit of propaganda trying to downplay it. It is a respectable aircraft, and it has done more than its fair share of devastation there. And if it comes at the cost of 20, 25 aircraft, well, it has punched quite hard too. But it is, yeah, vulnerable to anti-air defenses, including man-portable, shoulder-fired things even. But it'll be interesting to see how the full 34M it shakes out. At the beginning of the war, there was only a handful in service, but by now, there's as much as a full squadron available. And of course, they are carrying the latest munitions, well, when they're available. Let's flip it over here so you can see the underside better. I think that's a rocket pod on the edge of the wing on the lower pylon. We've got 2 large missiles or guided bombs on the intakes, and then there's a cruise missile on the center line. Unfortunately, with Hobby Master, the way the stand plugs in, it's a very secure stand, but it does mean you can't display anything on the center line. With some of the Su-27s and Su-33, you actually can, because the missiles will display right in front and right behind where the stand plugs in. But here, nope. If you want it, you've got to do this. And I don't know that a stand that would plug into the engines would work, because this thing is heavy. It is all metal. So yeah, you can see the big wheels, the big tires, the ladder. Kind of neat. Yeah, that's the thing too. Russia on paper has some pretty advanced weapons. Laser guided, satellite guided, TV, all that. Some pretty effective cruise missiles too, like the KH-47 M2. But they've had a shortage, especially since the war has gone on much longer than they planned for. They've exhausted their stocks of a lot of advanced ordnance, and they've had to resort to more conventional bombs, unguided even. That's why on my other 34 I have it kind of loaded up, a bit ridiculously so, but for fun, with just 4 big old honking bombs. They've also delivered cluster munitions and other things. But no, it's kind of neat. And like I said, this one is from 2022, Russian Air Force, VKS, I should say, as operating over Ukraine. And this has really shown the strengths and the weaknesses. Now, I will say one strength. Overall, these are a lot less expensive to produce than, say, an F-15E Strike Eagle, or obviously a F-35 when it's in the ground attack version. They're not cheap, of course, but economy of scale is pretty good, and it does seem like Sukhoi is able to produce these and deliver them quite consistently. So, while it's conventional in a lot of ways, they're trying to keep it up to date and also keep it effective, something that Russia can operate 100, 200 of at once, and kind of operate alongside their next generation fighters. So with that, let's get away from 2-seater strike aircraft, attack aircraft, and get back to some good old-fashioned multi-role. And we finally come to it, the Su-35, the Flanker E. And if you're thinking I already said there was a Flanker E in the Su-27 SM thing, you're not wrong. Things get really muddled and confusing. And who even knows? But anyway, probably the most advanced flanker we'll see go into production. And it has a history very similar to the others, going all the way back to the early 80s in the Soviet Union. Around 82-83, as Sukhoi was starting to get towards the end of the Su-27's design phase, and it was about to go into service, they were looking to the next generation. They wanted to, it's going to take years to develop it. They wanted, yes, an air superiority fighter, but a true multi-role fighter with more ground attack abilities, just more capabilities. At the end of 83, the communist government basically said, okay, fine, but base it on the Su-27. Thus, the Su-27M project was born, and it pretty much studied a lot of the things that we will see in the other aircraft. It had canards, at least the plan. They actually wanted to go to wet tail fins for more fuel. They made the stabilizers taller, all kinds of stuff like that. And of course, from the get-go, it had a radar and avionics that could target ground. The first prototype was actually the original T-10 prototype, reworked to be the T-10M1, and it would fly in 1988. It really wasn't at all an Su-27M1. It basically just had aerial refueling capability, somewhat reworked cockpit, so on and so forth. The second prototype, too, would be an update of an existing one. It wouldn't be until the third prototype that we actually had a new built airframe, and this was right around the time at the end of the USSR. And Sukhoi would kind of put a lot of effort into this, showing it off at air shows. In 95, there was the famous demonstrator with the thrust vectoring engines. They were incorporated into the design. Now, those were just a technology demonstrator. They were never combat capable engines. They did not have the service life. And they would start dropping features like the canards. Obviously, those would be transferred over. And the idea is still for this to be a multi-role fighter. It can be used as an interceptor, ground attack, maybe even naval surface attack, so on and so forth. And of course, it would be designated as the... Well, actually, they would first call it the Su-27 briefly. But then the Su-35 name would start to be used. And so, yeah, that would jump from the Su-27M. But they were having very little luck in the 90s. They were hoping to get purchases. They were really targeting Asia, Africa, South America. And they knew that Russia wasn't likely to purchase many just because of the situation at hand. Now, they would actually make an advanced version. Now, I guess we should say that they did build about 14 total Su-27Ms. Most were pre-production prototypes, but they did have around 3 full production model types, just, again, for demonstration. They would go back to the drawing board with the T-10B, T-1010, I can't talk now, 10BM test flights, and we start to see those in the 2006-2008 time period. And again, they're very much targeting other nations. But since it's economically bouncing back, the Russian Air Force has become interested. This is right around the time of the Su-27 SM updates, and they're purchasing the Su-30 SM. So in 2009, they expressed interest in the Su-35. Specifically, a variant for them was the Su-35S. The Su-35E was for export. And the usual things now, S having the best technology they can do, and also designed for Russian weapons and communications and so on and so forth. The Air Force would get some of the pre-production models and test models, but it would take a little while for the first true production Su-35 to come out around 2010. Testing, yada yada. And the Air Force would place an order for 48 more. Again, they already had a couple, so they ordered 48 more. And then they would actually sign a contract with China, who would purchase 24 around 2014. And they would get some other contracts with Indonesia and others. And then the VKS would place a second order for 50 in 2016. And this was really just to be an interim solution, a stopgap. New airframes. And it's really interesting how the technology transfers. Some of the stuff meant for the Su-27 SM would move into the 35. On the other hand, some of the stuff from the 35 project would move into the Su-30. It's all very symbiotic, which is the benefit of having a true family of aircraft. And as often happens, the interim solution might actually be the best plane, despite efforts in other directions that we will get to at the end of this video. But for now, what is this flanker? And is it better than the other ones we've talked about so far? The answer is yes. Yes, it is. Thanks to being based on the Su-27, and thanks to the upgrade programs for the SM and work with the 30 and 33 and even 34, this was just a mature, well-developed design. A solid Generation 4 Plus. Kind of reminds me of the FA-18 Super Hornets. Maybe not flashy in that sense, but just solid. And still quite capable. They really did get what they want. This is a true multi-role fighter. This isn't something retrofitted into something else. Now, they did have a little bit of a problem. One benefit to the Su-30 And the reason the Su-34 still has 2 crew, that way one person can work with the radar and the targeting, the weapons, leaving the other to fly and navigate. They did discover that during testing and evaluation, while it had the ability to target ground and operate a wide range of weapons, it kept the pilot pretty damn busy and distracted. Well, the answer was really the glass cockpit trialed out in the Su-27 SMs and other updates. So they integrated new multifunction displays, new heads-up displays, and they gave it 2 primary computer systems to kind of take the workload off the pilot. So single seat, but thanks to more automation, better displays, just better situational awareness. Yeah, you could do it. You're still, if you're going to have a true ground attack aircraft, you're good to have the 34 with 2 people. Plus you have a relief, and there's always the 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. But, you know, Sukhoi recognized that not all foreign customers wanted an aircraft with 2 people on board. In fact, that was the idea. They were going to offer the Su-30 if they needed a twin-seater, and what would become known as the Su-35E if you wanted a single-seat aircraft. Speaking of the 30, the engines from the 35 program, we have the thrust vectoring engines, and you can display them oriented with the Hobbymaster model. Those would basically be carried over to the Su-30 SM program. These are the AL-41F1 engines. Very good, very mature engines, and actually they're very closely related to what Russia was hoping would be its first 5th generation serial produced fighter. The thrust vectoring gave very good maneuverability. In fact, with the modern advancements in metallurgy and technology, this is why they deleted the canards and everything. It's still a little bit larger of an aircraft. It's just under 73 feet long. We have an enclosed front end there, a longer nose for housing equipment, avionics. This is not stealth, not even close to being stealth, but they were mindful of a small radar cross section, especially coming in, so they did what they could to round some edges. They had radar absorbing paint, especially on the inlets there and other things. So a nod towards stealth was made, but of course it's carrying all of its ordnance externally. We still have a 30mm cannon, still 150 rounds, like we've always had. We have 12 stations, 12 hard points. It has a pretty good carriage ability, about 17,500 pounds. So close to, a lot of the others, more than the original. Of course, it can carry anything modern, even some of the cruise missiles and large anti-shipping missiles, your KH-31s and KH-25s. Of course, from the beginning, the R-77, if they were going to major service. Otherwise, the R-27 and R-73 are the norm. Theoretically, it could even maybe carry an R-60, but that would never happen. That's just, it's outdated. This one here is an earlier paint scheme, circa 2013, so technically before it was fully in service, but still being used. It has 2 R-77s as kind of a demonstration. It also has these 2 guided missiles on the underneath there. It's neat. And yeah, it might be a little underwhelming, yet Russian studies claim that these could best the F-35 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1 back when they were being introduced around 2009. Lockheed was not happy about this claim and denied it, but it is capable of Mach 2.2 at altitude, or about Mach 1.2 at sea level. But more interestingly, it's capable of supercruise, which means it can go supersonic without the use of afterburner. Now, there are aircraft today that are better at supercruising than the Flanker E here, but there's plenty that can't do it at all, so take it for what you will. Max altitude is about 59, maybe 60,000 feet, depending on the payload, so plenty high. And range is plenty good. I mean, not a lot of that is changing, because, I mean, this is the Flanker we know and love. And that the Russians know and love. Originally, before the Russian Air Force was definitely going to buy Sukhoi, thought they would build about 150. But with the Russian interest, they decided to build at least 200 of these. To date, well, they crossed over the 100th plane at the end of 2018, and today they're over 150 planes built. So they're well on their way to the 200 they were counting on. And of those, roughly 100 have gone to the VKS and the others to export customers. Even though many weren't interested in the 90s, this has been a pretty good commercial success for Sukhoi. So with that said, how about its military service within the VKS? And here we have one in the more or less modern military camo paint in an air-to-air escort patrol configuration. Yes, I know that's a lot of missiles on it, but this is just for fun. And technically, like I said, the first real production Su-35S was being built in 2010. It was tested and started to be delivered in 2011. The VKS would have half a dozen or so for testing in 2012, 2013. And the first model we looked at was basically from a weapons test, seeing what it would work with, just, getting it ready to go. Then in 2014, a dozen would be delivered, another dozen in 2015, and soon the first contract would be fulfilled. And while it's still getting the bugs worked out, this model here is representing where they were deployed over Syria in 2016. This was an again further response to that Su-24 being shot down. They were flying escort missions of friendlies and intercept missions of potential hostiles. And as a secondary role, they were doing strikes. These engines are moved on this one. It's a plugged-in piece. These can also mount ECM pods on the tips, or these R-73s. We do have a total of 4 R-77s. To be fair, the Su-35 was the first to really be seen with this in actual combat theater. We still have the R-27. And thanks to the experiences over Syria, that did identify some computer problems, some other avionic problems that needed to be addressed, which allowed this to be declared fully operational in 2018. So there was a few minor revisions, a few bugs to be worked out, but nothing that required a major change or required production to be suspended. Just, real world applications. It's one thing to try things out in a laboratory or on paper, but so real world. On the other hand, 2019 was pretty eventful for Russian Su-35s flying over Syria. They did a lot of intercepts of Turkish aircraft, of Israeli aircraft, and they caused more than a few missions from there to be aborted. And in 2020, the VKS was showing 98 in inventory, so pretty much fully delivered, and so they actually placed yet another order, a third, for 30, which as far as I know is still ongoing. It seems to be, because looking at the best most recent records I can come up with from last year, it seems like they're flying about 110 of these now. Now, of course, some were lost over Ukraine. When the war started in February, the Su-35, along with the Su-30SM, were both being flown as basically air superiority, combat patrols, escort. And for about 6 weeks, the Su-35 enjoyed pretty good times. They weren't shot down, but finally one was lost. Another was shot down in June. And then subsequently, others have been lost for various military actions. Not huge numbers, but, they have lost a handful. Not really because of the aircraft itself, just because, someone's shooting fucking missiles at them. Or when they're landing on the ground, people aren't really happy that they're assaulting their homes and farms. Funny that. But the aircraft itself has actually proven very capable, very flexible, and it just kind of splits the difference between all the others. The 34 and the 30, they have definite advantages because they're more specific for a role. And the updated Su-27 SMs are great, but they are aging airframes. Just, they've been pushed as far as they can go. And in some ways, the Su-35S is as well. But it really has kind of become the star of the Russian Air Force. Even though at first no one wanted it. Instead, they wanted a 5th generation aircraft. One that's kind of gotten a lot of the attention and glory. But my question is it deserved? Well, let's dive in to our next and final Sukhoi. Moving from the Su-35S to the Su-57. And we're going to start here because this is the first model in 1/72 scale diecast we really were offered in America from Air Force One. And it's really not a bad model. In fact, in some areas it might even be better than the Hobby Master, but in other areas the Hobby's definitely. We'll get to it. This is Russia's first stealth fighter. It's considered 5th generation, and much has been made about it. Many plans, many pushback dates, and again, I am skeptical of where this will all end up. Where it began is way back in the 1970s. In 1979, as the Su-27 and the MiG-29 were taking shape, plans started for the next generation of fighter. This was the I-90 program, and that was basically for the 1990s. The idea was, 96 or so. And MiG and Sukhoi competed, and this time MiG was picked because MiG was still kind of the premier fighter maker of the time, and they began what was known as the MiG-144 project, a program, and it was to be a next generation to replace the Su-27, the MiG-29, and so on and so forth. What we think of as stealth. But of course, not much happened on either side. Now, Sukhoi would actually make some developments as early as 83. We kind of talked about that with the Su-35. Even though there was not official government funding, Sukhoi was going ahead. And so once the end of the Soviet Union happened, you will see technology appearing in first the Su-37, then of course the Su-35, which was kind of a takeoff from these design studies that really went back to the late 70s in the Soviet Union. Due to problems and lack of progress at MiG and the Russian economy, essentially this program was canceled in 1999. But America is now fielding the Fa-22 Raptor. The Eurofighter is finally getting going. So just a couple of years later, a new project is started, the PACFA, the PAKFA, for a 5th generation stealth fighter with secondary attack ability. And again, MiG and Sukhoi submit designs. And this time, around 2003, Sukhoi is picked. And their internal name for the project is T-50. 2004, the initial design concept is kind of approved, and then funding is allocated the next year from the government. Of course, other things are taking precedent, the Su-27 SM program, and then they're buying Su-30s and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, by 2007, the Russian government announces that the design phase is over, and they hope to have 3 flying prototypes by 2009. But there are already delays. The first prototype, the T-50-1, was completed partially through the year of 2009 and was ready for taxi testing that December, and then it would have its first test flight, about 45 minutes, in January of 2010. So they're not too far behind. A second prototype was created, and it flew the next year, 2011. And we would have 3 more prototypes. But in 2013, and really even before, they noticed issues due to do with structural cracking, fatigue, less than ideal service life. This was still at Sukhoi's main test facilities. That's because with this aircraft, they wanted to design something that was economically feasible, lightweight, and of course stealth. So they were trying to make it as light of an airframe as possible and using newer technologies. But with the 6th prototype, they had to beef things up, go to a larger wing, sacrifice a bit of stealth, and improve the metallurgy and composite materials. Then in 2014, the first prototype would be delivered to the VKS itself for its own testing and evaluation, and they would continue to make flying prototypes, ultimately making 10 of them, plus some non-flying ground test evaluation models. And from there, lots of plans. Now, originally, they were going to buy 150, and then that was reduced down to 55, then 12 by around 2016, 2017, 2018. And part of that was the Su-35. Now, what Sukhoi had done, kind of taking from developments from the whole T-50 program, they integrated some of the equipment into the Su-35 and Su-30 SMs, and vice versa. Some of the equipment made for these would make it into the T-50. Part of that was done just to get funding. Now, they had approached India about being a partner, and at first, around 2010, they were interested, but they backed out by 2013 when it was clear it wasn't going to meet their needs, and it was going to be over budget and under-deliver. So Russia's going it alone. And of course, again, their excuse for reducing the order down to 12, half a regiment, was because the Su-35 was doing so well at that time in Syria. But then, in May of 2019, yes, it's a propaganda thing, Putin announced they were going to buy 76. Again. So 3 completely, fully equipped regiments, squadrons, which was interesting because there's still not a production model even made yet. Therefore, the next year, the next month, the contract had to be signed, and that July, work began on building the first true production Su-57. And it crashed. The first production model crashed, so they had to build the second one, and that was delivered on Christmas of 2020. Now, it's a pretty smooth model underneath. Bay's closed, so it's on the stand. 2 engines. So, what is the Su-57? NATO codename Felon. The aircraft is smaller and lighter than the Su-27. It's just under 60 6 feet long and has a wingspan of a bit over 46 feet. It is still capable of Mach 2, so a little bit slower, but not by a whole lot. And it's capable of supercruise. Now, we've seen that with the Su-35, but the Su-57 can get up to Mach 1.6 and does have better range performance on that level as well. It uses, at least the initial version, the same AL-41F1 engines as the 35. It's also capable of thrust vectoring. It has kind of offset vertical stabilizers for stealth, and everything in the front's kind of done for stealth. The engine intakes are angled, the wings, not just the angles, but it also has anti-detection and like the paint and the coatings and the materials, at least in the front and the back, not so much. Part of that is cost savings, part of it is just Russian doctrine. So from the back, it's more detectable, but it's kind of going away then. From the front, it's said to have 30 times lower radar signature than the Su-27 and its variants, although it's not as stealthy as, say, the F-22. But Sukhoi, Russia, they maintain that it's not supposed to be that stealthy. To facilitate this and the performance, the tolerances are tighter than they've ever had to be before for Russian planes. Yet, Sukhoi actually claims this is a cheaper plane to produce and maintain than the Su-27. And they say this because they're hoping this will be the start of a whole new family. They nicknamed the program Megalopolis internally. They're hoping to make all kinds of versions and stuff. The cockpit is a pretty standard modern cockpit with digital displays, heads up, modern ejection seat. It does have some stealth attributes to the canopy, although again not as much as an FA-22. And this does have a 30mm cannon still. Guess they learned that lesson. So what about its weapons? One reason I do have this with its gear out, which is pretty rare for me, is so we can show the weapons bay. On the wing roots here, there's little bulges. Those are actually to house 2 short-range air-to-air missiles for self-defense. They had to be specially made, or at least a variant for this plane, to fit in those small roots. Taking the R-73, there was already an upgraded, improved version known as the R-74, and an improved version of that known as the R-74M. Well, specifically for the Su-57, they had to make the R-74M2, which basically a little improved, but had a smaller cross-section to fit successfully in the little bays. And we see this, with the F-22 as well. It has little side bays for sidewinders. They can pop out and still maintain stealth, and then close up when needed. Same here with the main weapons base. But these are quite small compared to Western. Each bay, there's 2, is about 14 feet in length, but only about 3 feet wide and quite shallow, frankly. Sukhois are always a little thin in this area, and this is no exception. There are 4 attachment points for weapons, and again, usually they have to be specially reconfigured to fit in here. They can take regular bombs to like cab 250, 500, and in this particular model we have 4 KH-59 M2 cruise missiles, little small cruise missiles. You can also take variants of the 35 and again, whatever else, but usually they do have to be modified a bit to fit in these rails. They can carry air-to-air. In fact, the standard air defense load would have 4 R-77Ms, which obviously is an updated version of the R-77. So you'd have 4 of those and then 2 R-74s for the air-to-air. But for air-to-ground, which this was designed from the get-go to have a ground attack ability, we have anti-radiation missiles that can fit it, cruise missiles obviously, anti-shipping missiles. But it's really hard to say. In fact, they didn't even begin weapons testing with external mounts until 2014, and didn't start testing the internal bays until 2016. So by this point, we don't really know a whole lot. Also, because of the internal bays here, on a regular Sukhoi 27 type, you have fuel stored in there. That's the base. So, really for the first time, we have external fuel storage. We have a plumbed wing. In fact, there are a total of 6 attachment points, hard points under the wings, 3 on each side. And that's a good transition to come to our next hobby master. This was actually the first release, and quite uniquely, it has external stores. We have 2 external tanks, and with 2, we have a pretty good range, about 2,500 miles, thus about double a regular Su-27. And we have 2 of the R-77s on the wings. Maximum altitude is pretty good for a Sukhoi, about 66,000 feet. So part of the aerodynamics, kind of the lighter weight, it worked there too. So not bad performance, especially compared to the F-35 versus the F-22. But of course, mounting anything on the wings is going to further destroy stealth ability, so this is more in either a combat patrol or a friendly skies configuration, or, you know, just a ferry configuration going point A to point B. Maybe one day they'll do a version with 6 underwing stores, but 4 is pretty cool. Of course, this one too had internal bays with removable ordnance, but when you put them on the stand, you can't do that. Although I am experimenting with the proper sized plug for the engines, so I may try putting it on the other type of stand so I can play around with it. And you never know what Hobby Master might do. But yeah, that is our aircraft in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it, of course. But what about its combat record, its service history? After all, they started building this in 2009. Like I said, weapons testing really started in 2016, and that led to February 2018. Towards the end of that month, 4, which would have been 4 out of the 5, Phase 2 prototypes were sent to Syria. This would actually be the Felon's first international flight. They would land there, and then they would be deployed on 10 different missions alongside Su-35Ss. And it said that they even launched some cruise missiles, kind of engage things, test things in a combat theater. Still very much a test. These are still very much prototypes, but they're operating in a combat area, and they are delivering live ordnance. We don't really know much more than that. Then they were withdrawn to Russia after the missions were over in a month. In 2019, they would again go to Syria, and again to really kind of flesh out their weapons carrying capability, especially after Putin's announcement that they were going to now require 76, and they were prepping up to make the production model. So data from this second field test run would help with the full production models. And from there, like I said, in 2020, Christmas, December 25th, Russia announced to the world that it had put the Su-27 into full service. This would make it its first 5th generation stealth fighter. And one had been delivered. In 2021, Sukhoi begins production, really going towards the end of 2022. The beginning of 2022, they had sent 4 productions over. By the end of that year, 10 production models had been delivered to the VKS. So, again, one was lost due to an accident. And we do see these start to get deployed. And there is talk about them being used in Ukraine. Russia says that the Su-27 was deployed in Ukraine during the early months of the war, so March, April of 2022. And then in June, they were equipped with anti-radiation missiles so they could, be wild weasels, serve the seed row. They were there to identify and then target and then destroy Ukrainian anti-air defenses. And then in October of that year, the general in charge of all Russian forces operating in Ukraine publicly announced that the Su-27 had successfully engaged both air and ground targets, delivering a wide range of munitions, including the R-37M, essentially the same weapon used on the MiG-31 Foxhound. That's what Russia says. That's the PR. Other sources, especially a couple of journalistic units in England, claim that that's not what's happening. They actually say that they're pretty afraid to really put the 57s that they have in harm's way, because if one is lost through mechanical failure or combat, it would be negative for them. Propaganda and all that being what it is. So who's to say? Russia says they're using them over Ukraine. Other people doubt their word. Take it as you will. Right now, it's too new. We really don't know. We do know that there are 5 or so stationed at an airbase just 300 miles from the Ukrainian border. And then the other 5 are off doing their thing. And of course, they're still testing and evaluating. In fact, there were already plans for the Su-27M, an updated version. It'll have several small tweaks to the aviation, weapons carriage, but the big update for the 57M are new engines. From the get-go, people have been critical of the AL-41F1 engines. It's kind of a little bit older technology, and again, they don't really have stealth attributes back here. So a new engine and nozzle are being developed, and thus a new variant could go into production, but it's not supposed to happen for another couple of years. The idea when the 76 order contract was signed in 2019 was for all to be delivered by the year 2028. We'll see. It depends how much they can ramp up production. Kind of depends if Sukhoi's telling the truth about this being cheaper and easier to produce than the 27s. Because, development does take time, but if you do kind of get your design down, once you have everything in place to make them, how quickly can you turn them out? That's to be seen. Also rejection rates, how many pass testing, because as I said a minute ago, this does have much tighter, more exacting tolerances than other Russian jets in the past. And on top of that, the Su-35S, using some of the same technology, is doing really well, and there's over 100 in service. So is there really a place for the Su-57? And even if there is, what's its future post the beginning of the Ukraine war? The Felon is built with quite a bit of new technology, and really ever since the beginning of the invasion of Crimea in 2014, Russia has put itself in an awkward international position. There have been sanctions, and certain nations unwilling to do business with them. Other nations, not so much. They went ahead. But then in February 2022, at the beginning of the true invasion, the full invasion of Ukraine, Russia was sanctioned pretty much by all of Europe and much of the rest of the world. That meant that doing business was difficult, and potential international customers that might want to buy a version of the Su-27 may or may not be dissuaded. And on top of that, these are still being put together with parts imported, at least some parts like microprocessors, computer technologies, even certain raw materials not readily available within Russia from foreign sources, and it's uncertain if Russia will find access. Now, of course, China is a possibility that they might continue wanting to do business, but how able will they be to do that? I don't know. No one really knows. It may not be a big deal at all, and it may be a big deal. We'll have to just find out. Can they keep making these? Or is this going to put them in a position where they just don't have all the resources they need? And even if they get them, Sukhoi really needs foreign investment, foreign people to pick this aircraft up. They've had it with the 27s and the 30s especially, but even the 35. I don't know. Future is unknown, and it's just hard to know the truth from what Russia says, because this is a big deal. This is a big public relations deal to have a 5th generation fighter. We'll see. Because as much as the Su-35 is doing well, it is still based essentially on updated Soviet-era technology. This, while it is somewhat in the same family, is definitely a modern aircraft that's more new than old. So if they can make it work, that's not a bad thing for them. Should also mention there have been talks and even plans to do a carrier-based version, but I don't think that's really gone much of anywhere yet. There's also been talk about doing a 2-seat version, either as a strike aircraft or a training aircraft, but again, not really anywhere. As far as I know, India was the most likely potential customer, and they backed out a decade ago. China's doing their own thing with like the J-20 and J-31, so they don't really seem integrated into it much. And I even considered not putting the felon in this video, but it is related enough to the 27 flanker family, and is potentially its replacement, that I thought, why not? So, what do you think of the two, Air Force One versus Hobbymaster? They're both neat. Stealth aircraft are kind of neat in this scale because they end up almost being entirely metal. The only downside is displaying it with weapons on the stand. They really should have done the plug-in style like what they did with the Foxhound, so you can have the doors open or closed and still have it in flight. But so with that, let's kind of move on and begin to wrap this up. Well, one more thing. You saw me maybe feeling here. The antenna on this earlier Hobbymaster is taller. This one's shorter and more rounded off. I also noticed that I believe it's the earth sensor under the nose is a different shape. It's slightly more conventional on this one and slightly recessed. Now, I know the sensor can flip around, so it may just be in different positions, but it is different there. But what really got me noticing, the cans are different. On the original one here, we have ribbing and we have serrated edges. But this one, we don't. It's a smooth edge and less kind of patterning on the top. Does anyone know, is that the difference between a pre-production and a production model, or is that kind of running changes going towards the 57M? I think it's neat that Hobbymaster did that, and since this is the first release, I would suspect it's the older variant, compared to this one. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you made it to this point. Just notice those little differences. That's why I do like Hobby Master. They do come out with some of the little things. Our Air Force doesn't have anything under the nose or up here. It's just smooth. So not really worth talking about. Alrighty, now for real, we'll move on. So do you agree with me that the Felon seems to be more of a propaganda PR thing, and that honestly the 35 is kind of the real winner? Not quite to the same extent, but it does remind me of the F-22 Raptor. So much time and energy went into building it, and it was a good aircraft, but then relatively few were produced, and it just, yeah. And the thing with this, it's been around for 15 years, and they've yet to make enough production models to equip an entire squadron, an entire regiment. And just kind of knowing how things have been managed in the Russian military, who knows where the funding to build these went. And who knows what the capabilities really are and are not. As we've seen throughout this video and the MiG video, Russia, previously the USSR, is very, very capable of making an acceptable aircraft, a good aircraft, an excellent aircraft. But they tend to be more at their best when they're going for sturdy, dependable, easy to work on, relatively inexpensive. When they try to go more advanced, we saw it a bit with the MiG-23, and before that the MiG-19. Not that those aircraft didn't work, but they gave more problems than, say, the MiG-17, the MiG-21, or the MiG-29. And I have to wonder if the Su-27 will be that way. Only time will find out, I guess. But the Su-35 is certainly a surprise hit, and really a worthy successor to the original generation. So what about the three I have up here? At first glance, they may not look that different, but I'm actually very happy with the three I've picked over the years. The original Soviet one for being such an early production with a few differences. It's nice to have a Russian one. And having a somewhat modern Ukrainian one to both represent a later production, Su-27, as well as Ukrainian updated one. And then, it really shouldn't make me as happy as it does, but the Su-27 SM, it's just neat seeing the changes made to the design, and the fact that they're serving probably long past anyone expected them to. As to which one is my favorite, I don't know if I could really pick. The story behind the Ukrainian is probably the coolest. On the other hand, I am a student of Cold War history, grew up in that era, so that's kind of the Sukhoi I would have recognized as a kid. But on the other hand, the SM is the current one that we've seen in Syria and now Ukraine. I don't really think I could pick. I really don't. Sorry. So, what about the children? The 30, 33, 34. All are very neat, and it really shows how Sukhoi has really embraced capitalism, trying to make things for different customers. They were all, with the exception of maybe the 33, made for export, or at least just as much of a focus on export as domestic. In fact, like the Su-30 and the Su-35 didn't even really start off for Russia, and the Su-34, not a whole lot more either. And it's remarkable just how many have come into service. Anyway, as far as my favorite, least favorite, have you, as much as I do think it's neat, I have to say my least favorite is the SU-30. Nothing against it, but it's very conventional. And I don't know. Again, it's not that I don't like it. It's just compared to the other two, it's the least interesting to me. By all rights, I should say the SU-33. It's the least advanced, the one made in the smallest numbers. But I love naval aircraft, especially carrier-based ones. I just do. And I like it. So there you go. There's just something about the Flanker D that attracts me. But I have to say my favorite of the three, definitely the SU-34. It's radically different. It's seen a good bit of use. It's all new. You know, your 33s all go back to the 90s. Your 30s are kind of a hodgepodge of rebuilds and new manufacture. But the 34s, as we saw, there's even the current M version that's been updated. And it just looks neat. Plus, I really want to get inside one day and just see what it's like. Certainly an interesting look to the nose, the kind of duckbill look to it. And you can have a lot of fun with ordnance loadouts with these, because so many different configurations would be correct, or at least okay, acceptable. And the long range, and the fact that it can still operate as a fighter, at least in some ways, you know, is neat. I recognize it's a variant, and obviously the 35 is the culmination of this series. So, all things considered, it's the best one because it is multi-purpose and has the newest technology. But yeah, 34, the fullback, it's just my personal favorite. But what's yours? What do you think of the variants? Which one would you pick? We're not talking the Chinese ones, not because I don't like them. I've done videos in the past, and maybe eventually I'll do one on the Chinese series from the 11, the 15, the 16, and so on. But I'm trying to keep this reasonably narrowed down to Russia and adjacent. So, in 2023, where are we at when it comes to service? I'm not going to try for exact numbers because, one, it's hard to really trust anything that comes out of Russia. Two, with a war ongoing, it will change. And three, Sukhoi is still making planes, so that'll change. We're just giving a general idea. So, the Su-27, we basically have 100 in the VKS service, at least frontline active service, with several more different types in reserve or for parts or just on the books, but not really serviceable. And then the Navy, the Naval Aviation, has 50-ish. Most of theirs have not been updated to the SM3 type standard like the Air Forces. So, still a decent chunk flying. As for the Su-33, obviously the Air Force doesn't fly these. The Navy does. They still only have the original purchase order, and I believe that they're down to about 18, maybe even fewer now. Sometimes they kind of come in and out. But, yeah, this is the one area where the MiG-29K has bested Sukhoi. They have 22 of those, at least they've ordered 22. I don't know how many are still serviceable. So they're kind of running neck and neck with each other. Some fly off the carrier, others operate from shore bases, and of course they rotate in and out for maintenance and what have you. So definitely our smallest production number. Still think it's a cool plane though. As for the Su-30, the Air Force has about 110 total. 90 are of the older SM standard, and about 20 are of the newer SM 2 standard update, and that number should change as time goes on. I don't believe there's any outstanding orders. What they have is what they have, and the Naval Aviation is showing to have a few as well, around 30, give or take. And I can understand them operating, obviously not from carriers, from shore bases, but the long range, the good endurance, the aerial refueling would work well for them as a air patrol interdictor type aircraft. Small number, but gives them what they need. And as for our last one here, it's actually the largest number so far. There's about 150 in the VKS. I don't believe Naval Aviation has picked up any. If so, it's a small number. Most are of the original Su-34, although we are starting to see more and more Su-34Ms, both factory new and refurbished. The differences are internal mostly and with weapons carriage, so hard to identify from the outside. But again, that allowed them to retire hundreds of older planes. They do still have some Su-24s, but they're being phased out. And still plenty of Su-25s, as many as 200. But that's just a simple, dependable little plane. And I can understand the two complementing each other very well. One's high technology, very long range. One's just kind of a down in the mud and dirt fighter. It's like a somewhat scaled back A-10. Although, to be fair, it predates the A-10. So, is the A-10 a scaled up Su-25 Frogfoot? Maybe. Now let's move down here. The Su-35. They're showing about 110 in service, so roughly the same as the Su-30. But they have roughly 20 more on order. So by the time that gets done, even adjusting for losses or retirement of higher hour airframes, we're going to see more of these than the original 27s or the 30s, and almost as many as the 34s. So neat. And again, I don't believe the Navy has any. If so, it's a small number, but it doesn't really fit their mission profile for what they need. And then finally, our Felon. Since 2009, over the past 14 years, they've built a grand total of 21. And that might not sound so bad. I mean, that could be a whole regiment, a whole squad, except 10 of them were prototype or pre-production. Some of them not even flying, some of them lost, destroyed. The reality is we just crossed the line where we had 11 quote-unquote production models made, and so we can't even really equip an entire squad yet. We do see around 6 operating in one go. Some are obviously going to be kept back for testing and improvement, and as we talked about, there's already an improved version coming, or at least planned for. I'm sorry, I'm just skeptical about it. Maybe I'll be completely wrong, but it doesn't really seem. We'll see. We will see. So, just doing some pencil math in my head, just really quickly rounding and sketching. It seems like that combining the Russian Air Force and Navy, there are roughly 600 SUs based on the original 27 here, and also including the few Felons in service. I'm not counting the remaining 24s or the Frogfoots, the 25s, but the 27 and its children and grandchildren, roughly 600. Not a small fleet. Now, how many are fully operational? How many are available for service? How many have been updated? That's the question. There are more, at least on paper and inventory, but I've learned to be skeptical about numbers on paper within Russia. The recent showing of tank armor kind of taught me that. But it is an important part, because when you look at how many MiGs they have, it's far fewer. Some older 29s, they're not buying new ones. The MiG-35 is supposed to come in. They've got fewer of those than they maybe 6. I mean, it's not an impressive number. the bigger one would be the MiG-29K. The MiG-31 also still plays an important role thanks to the updates, but all your other MiGs have been retired out. The 27, the 25, the 23, the 21, and of course older. So yeah, it's kind of mostly just being carried by the 29 and the 31 today. Meaning that even though MiG has had some successes, the post-Soviet era has really belonged to Sukhoi. And it's interesting that the same kind of goes for Ukraine, although they have a reasonably large MiG-29 fleet as well. But you have Su-27 on Su-27 action. These are really big models too. Based on the scale, they're each roughly a foot long, over 8 inches wide. It's really hard to find shelf room. Oh well. And while other brands do make them, and other brands sometimes do get it right, where Hobbymaster fails, overall, Hobbymaster seems to hit that sweet spot between price and quality. Other brands are more expensive, other brands are cheaper. Hobbymaster gives you a decent amount for your buck. What I like about them is they're also durable. They're also easy to change. Like, things are modular. The landing gear tend to have little units that pop in and out. The ordnance are on rails that you can just slide in, peg in. They're very user friendly compared to some of the others. I really want to like caliber wings, but they just, for one thing, their QC is kind of all over the place, and for another, their stuff is just ridiculously fragile sometimes. And they cost more than a Hobbymaster. Same thing goes for JC. They're about the same price as a Hobbymaster, and they do get some things right, but their stands are very wiggly wobbly, and their metal is fine, but the plastic they use, Hobbymaster's got their plastic right, their polymer. It's not rubbery, but it has a bit of flex to it, whereas some of the others, they just snap apart. I think a lot of the other brands are just meant to be put on a shelf and admired from afar and never touched. That doesn't do a blind guy any fucking good. I don't play with them, but I like to get them down and handle them. And other people I've seen that buy Hobbymasters do too. They like to do videos like this, examine them, show people, have fun with them, change the weapon loadouts, do things like that, customize them. That's kind of the point of owning. So, pretty happy with Hobbymaster. And other brands I like Corgi, but they're more the UK planes, Harriers, and Jaguars, and they were the kind of go-to people for the Tornado until Hobbymaster came out with Tornadoes. And there are, Air Force One, which we looked at one of. They have their pros. They're not bad. In fact, most of my Chinese planes are Air Force One because they do lots of 172 scale that others don't. For example, the J-16, the J-20. So that's cool. Air Force Ones are also durable. They don't have necessarily the detail, but they are cheaper than Hobbymaster, and they are very durable. And they tend to be all metal. Even things like the pitot tubes can be metal on Air Force One. That does make them a little thick, not as scale accurate. And their pilots tend to be very crude. I mean, Hobbymaster pilots are nothing to get too excited about, but Air Force Ones are basically a ball on some quote-unquote shoulders, but better than nothing. No, it's just fun. And for my Sukhois, I just think the Hobbymasters are nice. But what do you think? Maybe you like the Herpas or the JCs or any of the other brands that do them. I noticed that Caliber Wings just released a MiG-31. I'm really glad Hobbymaster did, because I'm very happy with those. I'm not going to worry about a Caliber. Unfortunately, Caliber is the one that does the Su-24. And I think it's a nice plane, but every time I get it down, I'm worried I'm going to break something. Yeah, that's no fun. Century Wings is closely related to Hobby Master, and they've done some neat stuff, but they don't do Russian. They tend to do some neat American, especially American Navy. Like they did the A6. They also do a Dynamite SR-71 Blackbird. But yeah, I'm just talking now. But we're hanging out, right? Talking Russian planes. I really do hope someone does, like the Sukhoi, the fitter, the older ones one day. I'd like to also see an Su-15, an Su-7 or 9. I would have said one time we'll never get those, but I never thought we would get what we have here, or a MiG-23 or MiG-31. So Russian stuff is getting really popular because of recent political events. And I'll just end kind of where what I said towards the beginning. This is not a political video. I studied Russia. I lived in Russia. I like the Russian people. What's happening on the political front is wrong. And rarely do I just categorically say, I'm one of those people that usually say the world's never black and white. It's always complicated. This is one of those few times when it is black and white. The invasion was a dumb idea. It hurt Ukraine, obviously, but it's also hurt Russia a great deal. They've lost a lot of prestige, lost a lot of money, put themselves in a very vulnerable position. So from either perspective, it's bad. And I'm just saying that because I don't want anyone thinking me doing long videos about MiGs or Sukhois is some kind of pro-war thing. It's not. I'm actually quite anti-war. I'm almost a pacifist. I just think humanity has better ways of dealing with issues, talking, negotiating. Because, the thing about war is you kill a bunch of people, destroy a bunch of houses and infrastructure, destroy a bunch of crops that people need, and then you still have to sit down at a table and negotiate a surrender and a treaty. There's always talking. I just kind of think it's more sensible to skip all the expensive shooting at each other. And I mean, if we're going to have a fight, why can't we just do boxing? Have a boxing tournament if you need to get some aggression out. That's why I thought the space race was good. It was a way for Russia and America to really compete. And really, but also it was progressive. It cost money, but at least the only lives it cost, they were volunteers. They were people doing it willingly. They weren't conscripts. So I just wanted to say that, and that's why I also wanted to make sure of having a Ukrainian aircraft. Plus, it is just cool, but the Sukhois, just like the MiG-29, are on both sides in this thing, and one way or the other, I think we can all hope and wish for this war to be over soon. Right? I mean, that's it going on longer is doing no one any good. But yeah, just disclosure there at the end. Anyway, appreciate you hanging out with me. If for some reason you haven't checked out the video on the MiGs and you have some time over a few days, yeah, do so. Why not? The bad thing about these planes is they are so big and it's so complicated to get them down. They're on a high shelf that once I put them back up, I probably won't get a chance to mess with them again for another year or so, but that's okay. It's always fun to revisit the planes. I kind of cycle through. Maybe next I'll look at U.S. I kind of feel like I should look at the Century series again. What do you think? F-100? F-101 Voodoo? Just a thought. But yeah, let me know. Feel free to comment. Again, apologies for getting anything wrong. But I'm sure I did. I mean, I'm just sitting here behind a camera just talking. I don't have notes or anything. So, yeah. This is Misha, and I'm going to bed.